The Paris attacks show how the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant is capable of hitting targets far from home. How far can ISIL go? And is military confrontation the best way to deal with the threat? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finnegan. Calls for tougher security measures are growing following the Paris attacks. The leaders of the 20 most powerful countries have agreed to step up border controls and aviation security. Meeting in Turkey, the G20 leaders say they remain committed to tackling how terrorism is financed and will share more information. With the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant claiming responsibility for the Paris attacks, many are questioning the tactics used against the group so far. France is stepping up its military operations against ISIL. Some critics say that will only aggravate the threat, with some going as far as to say that ISIL activities in the West are now very much a reality. Well, ISIL has been expanding beyond its base in Iraq and Syria since it declared a caliphate more than a year ago. The group has turned its threats into reality by claiming responsibility for several recent attacks. On Thursday, the day before the Paris attacks, ISIL claimed responsibility for 2 suicide bomb blasts in the Lebanese capital. At least 43 people were killed in Beirut. An Egyptian group affiliated to ISIL called the Sinai Province claimed responsibility for the Russian plane crash last month, which killed 224 people on board. And in June, 3 separate attacks in 3 countries. The first in France, where a severed head was found outside a chemical factory. Although ISIL hasn't directly claimed responsibility, the attacker was said to have links to radical groups. Later on the same day, ISIL claimed responsibility for killing 25 people in a suicide bomb blast at a mosque in Kuwait. ISIL also claimed responsibility for attacking a hotel resort in Tunisia and the killing of 38 people there, mainly tourists. All right, let's introduce you to our guests for today's discussion. From London, we're joined by Hassan Hassan, Associate Fellow at Chatham House and author of ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror. From Manchester, Afshin Shahi, Director of the Centre for the Study of Political Islam at Bradford University. And from New York, we're joined by Elliot Ackerman, Member of the Council on Foreign Relations and former White House Fellow in the Obama administration. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Afshin, I want to start with you. President Hollande has promised a merciless response to the Paris attacks. What will it take to defeat ISIL, to erase it not only as a fighting force but as an ideology, its attractiveness, its to young, disaffected people, its brand?
I think if you really want to defeat your enemy, you need to understand your enemy first. ISIS is powerful not because only it has a military capability or because it has unbelievably sophisticated global network. ISIS is powerful because it has a very attractive and powerful brand. And you really cannot confront this entity, the so-called Islamic State, unless you can actually confront it in every single level. Of course, militaristically as well as ideologically as well. And there are a variety of factors within the territories that actually the Islamic State is still controlling, and within countries like Iraq and Syria that are still actually fueling kind of this ideological battle, which is in many ways benefiting the side of the Islamic State. Sectarianism more and more becoming a problem. The sectarian divides actually has been a very, very good news for ISIS, and ISIS has been actually banking on religious division, which is becoming more and more problematic in the region. And by using kind of sectarian religious narratives and creating the binaries of us versus them, good versus evil, black versus white, they've been trying to kind of recruit and mobilize and justify the gruesome activities based on these binaries of us versus them.
So Afshin, how do you counter all of that?
Of course, we cannot come up with a single strategy, just in the same way that we can't reduce ISIS to a single definition. We cannot actually come up with a single strategy which could actually eliminate ISIS, in the matter of days. We need actually to pay attention to these issues one by one if we really mean business when it comes to kind of dealing with ISIS. One of the most important issues that I suppose a lot of people have been talking about over the last year, but nobody has done enough about it, is actually controlling the economic sources of ISIS. Everybody knows that ISIS now is the richest terrorist organization in history. Everybody has been talking about the fact that ISIS has been making millions and millions of dollars every week purely because of the fact that they can sell oil even now as we speak in the international oil market. And as long as the international community doesn't have the necessary determination to at least control their economic activities, we really cannot be serious enough about tackling the organization and confronting the ideology.
Elliot Ackerman, what do you make of what you've just heard there? Will the West now, do you think, have to rethink its strategy on dealing with ISIL? I mean, it's clear current tactics are not working. Has the West's strategy, if it has one at the moment, on ISIL been misguided or naive, do you think? What mistakes have been made in countering ISIL thus far?
I would preface my remarks by saying, I served in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, and spent the last decade fighting Islamic extremism. And as a former soldier, I pray for peace. I want these wars to end. I think we all want these wars to end. That being said, I think we've reached an inflection point with the attacks in France. The current strategy is not working, and as was said, the Islamic State right now has a very powerful and effective brand. One of the reasons their brand is so strong is because they've been winning. They've been seizing ground, they've been on the march, they've been establishing their caliphate in the last 2 years, and by and large, it's worked and people have flocked to their banner. But to effectively counter the Islamic State, so we don't see as many of these attacks, we right now need to dismantle the Islamic State. And the Islamic State has its antecedents in Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and but what they've managed to do is they are no longer a murky or shadowy terrorist organization. They have organized as a state, and we should treat them as a state. And when engaging them and looking to dismantle the Islamic State, we need to destroy that state. And that's something actually that the armies of the West and the militaries of the West are well suited to do, as opposed to fighting shadowy terrorist organizations. We know how to engage in a conventional war. And I think we're at the point right now where serious talk should be occurring about how to form a coalition and to go take the ground that the Islamic State calls home.
But
Elliot, talk about retaking Mosul, retaking Ramadi, retaking Raqqa, and not using the surrogate forces such as the Kurds and the Iraqi security forces that have largely been ineffective to this point. So I think we're at a point right now where we need to get real about talking about
any ground offensive, though, Elliot, can't. It might rid Iraq and Syria physically of ISIL, but it can't destroy an ideology, isn't there? I mean, can it, rather? And if there is a ground offensive, what must the US and its allies do to avoid the post-conflict mistakes that were made in Iraq, for example?
I've heard that refrain before, that you can't destroy an ideology. And regrettably, I think we are at a point right now where there is going to be real conflict, there is going to be real war. But if we look at the 20th century, one of the great defining ideological conflicts of that age was the tension between fascism, democracy, and communism. Fascism and communism were ideologies, and unfortunately, dismantling those ideologies, we had to go through decades of war. We might be at that point with this, and I think there's going to be a lot of bloodshed and a lot of fighting ahead in order to reckon with this. And then there's the question of, well, how do you keep it from looking like a post-invasion Iraq? And I think that's a very, very legitimate concern. I served in post-invasion Iraq, and it was by and large a disaster. I think that the talks that go on right now for what any type of intervention looks like, you need to have a very broad-based coalition, one that uses regional partners, international partners. I think the U.S. has to get real about talking, and the West has to get real about talking with Russia and Iran, even though our interests might not be completely aligned. Again, the Allies had an alignment with the Soviet Union in the Second World War. But I think those are the types of terms we're talking about. And until we step up and recognize that we might not have wanted this fight as a civilized world, but it's come to us. Until we recognize that, there's going to be more terrorist attacks. And there's been 3: the Ankara bombing, the bombing in Beirut, and Paris in the last month. Hundreds of dead. And I don't think ISIS is showing a willingness to abate from those attacks.
Hassan, what do you make of what you've heard so far? Would a military victory against ISIL, the capture of the territory that it currently holds in Iraq and Syria, the elimination or capture of its leaders, will that be enough to vanquish the organization?
It won't be enough for sure. I think that step of defeating ISIS on the ground is a crucial first step to defeating the ideology itself. ISIS is built around this idea of a state building, building enterprise, and it has become this global phenomenon because it has established itself as a force on the ground, viable force that is capable of striking against its enemies and playing smart and deploying. I think the most important thing is its ability to deploy information and attack territory and also hold territory. And I think that would be, defeating ISIS on the ground physically would be a crucial first step to restraining the organization globally. And we've seen evidence of this already in the region. When ISIS, over the past year, after the takeover of Mosul, it started to lose some ground in the region, some appeal, because it has taken missteps. It maybe played its hand sometimes in terms of killing and beheading people who, for people in the region, they seem religious and they're not the infidels that ISIS claims to be. So I think its behavior on the ground affects its image abroad. And I think ISIS globally is still able to say we are the caliphate. In the region, its appeal is a bit dwindling.
Okay. Hassan, is there a danger, do you think, after Friday's attacks, with anger running so high, governments may be pushed to seek a simple, a quick, a heavy-handed response to a problem that actually demands a much more complex set of solutions?
Yeah, I think this is also key. In order to restrain ISIS again, you need to restrain your expectations. And we've seen this trend every time a national of a foreign country gets either killed or beheaded by ISIS, or ISIS strikes in a certain country. What we see is a few days of exaggerated response, that very heavy-handed, and it's meant to play hard, to say we're tough. We've seen that with the Jordanians, for example, earlier this year when a Jordanian pilot was burned alive by ISIS. What did the Jordanians do? They launched a very heavy campaign of attacks against ISIS, but then that faded later. And we've seen Jordan taking a back seat in the fight against ISIS. So this lack of consistency in the fight against ISIS, not only in military terms, but also in political terms. You need to recognize that ISIS has grown and becomes this big because of the Syrian conflict, because of the Iraqi political failures. And unless you start solving these issues, ISIS will continue to claim its legitimacy.
Afshin, ISIL is not going to lie down and take any offensive against it lightly, is it? As an organization, it has the capacity to change.
This is exactly the heart of the problem, and that's why, with all due respect, I disagree with Elliot's point about the fact that we need to treat ISIS as a state. ISIS is not a state, and it is extremely difficult to define what ISIS is. Maybe ISIS is a transnational jihadi movement which is attempting to create a nation state. Nonetheless, it doesn't resemble what we understand classically as a nation state, and this is exactly the heart of the problem. And actually, when you look at what happened 2 days ago in Paris, on the way to Manchester this afternoon, I was listening to radio and somebody was talking about the profile of one of the suicide bombers in Paris. His name is Ismail Mustafai. And he's the person who had years and years of problems with law enforcement authorities in Paris. So when you try to kind of focus on the heart of the matter and look at some of these individuals who apparently represent the so-called Islamic State, you realize that actually there are some other important issues which have been around for a very, very, very long time, years and years before ISIS, which are still relevant. And these important issues easily, in a situation like what we see right now, can be translated to pro-ISIS ideologies. We see the issues of alienation, issues of marginalization, issues of Islamophobia, issues of deprivation, etc., etc. The fact that actually we see more and more polarization in Europe, these ideas, these problems that we have been facing in Europe for a very long time easily can be used as a God-given gift for transnational jihadi extremist organization to use in order to recruit and in order to mobilize. So that's why it is extremely difficult to define what ISIS is. I mean, if you look at kind of this so-called global organization, now there are so many kind of insurgency organizations around the world, they claiming to represent ISIS. Like the insurgency in Sinai, apparently that is representing basically one of the vilayats of the Islamic State. The insurgency in Sinai has been going on for a very, very, very long time, and it did not come about as the result of ISIS. Or insurgency in Afghanistan. Now we know that there is kind of a bit of factionalism between various Talibani networks. Some of them have affiliated themselves to the Islamic State, and I can go on and on and on and on. So what we see that, I mean, we're not dealing with the state, we're dealing with a very attractive new brand. Until recently, this brand was Al-Qaeda, and now we have a new brand which is more attractive. So different insurgency groups from different parts of the world, regardless of their cause, regardless of actually what they want to achieve, they may actually use this brand in order to justify and rationalize what they do, and in order to have actually an easier experience when it comes to recruitment and obviously legitimizing what they do.
All right, let's get Elliot's response then to your criticism of what he was saying a little earlier. Elliot?
Well, the Islamic State has self-identified as a state, and when they do that, I take them seriously. They hold and administer vast swaths of territory inside Iraq and Syria. I spend some time in Iraq. If you're in Erbil or outside of Mosul, it surely feels like a state. They are administering that ground. And then we have to ask the question is, why are all these transnational jihadi groups who why are they affiliating with the Islamic State? Why aren't they claiming affiliation with Al-Qaeda Central? Or why aren't they claiming affiliation with groups like Jabhat al-Nusra inside of Syria, which is also affiliated with Al-Qaeda Central? And the reason for that is that the Islamic State, frankly, is winning. They've shown incredible success, particularly by transitioning from being a terrorist organization into having the legitimacy of a state. They've claimed that legitimacy, and they've been very successful in doing so. So the question now becomes for the West, and I would say the civilized world, because I would include many nations that aren't formally part of the West in that, is will we allow the Islamic State to maintain the territory that it holds, and what are the implications of that? And I think we've seen what the implications of that are. Again, in the last month, we've had 3 attacks, all as bloody as the Paris attacks. And if we choose that the Islamic State cannot exist and that it needs to be dismantled, it makes the most sense to do that now and not to wait.
Okay.
And so I have to take them at their word, and I think to not take them at their word is incredibly dangerous.
Afshin, you were nodding in agreement and then shaking your head there.
I mean, first of all, I do find this binary of civilized versus uncivilized extremely troubling. This is exactly the kind of binaries that Islamic State or Al-Qaeda have been trying to use for a very long time. Us versus them, good versus evil, black versus white. I think this is extremely troubling, and we really have to refrain from that kind of language if we're really serious about confronting a binary ideology like what we see right now represented by the Islamic State. I don't think the very fact that the Islamic State represents itself or introduces itself as a state, we have to agree with it. There are so many other insurgency groups around the world. They regard themselves as legitimate rulers, as legitimate states, and so on. But the very fact that they say it, that doesn't mean we should take it seriously. Right. I agree with you.
But they don't hold territory. They don't hold vast swaths of territory.
But the reason that their whole territory
they hold
is
vast
not
swaths of
because
territory.
actually they have a state,
Cannot be ignored. It can't be ignored.
Gents, we can't all talk at once here. Hang on a second. We can't all talk at once. Elliot, please make that point, and then Afshin can respond to it.
You know, the Islamic State holds vast swaths of territory straddling what are the Sykes-Picot agreements of modern-day Syria and Iraq. They've expressed their intent to destroy Sykes-Picot. Those are in Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's remarks in 2014 when he announced the caliphate. If we ignore them, if we don't take them at their word, that's extremely dangerous. And to the point of calling them civilized versus uncivilized, I'm sorry, but if you watch the videos, the beheading videos, the drowning videos, that's not civilized behavior. Though I would say we are all united from whatever country you are as being sort of children of the age of enlightenment.
Afshin,
and I think that is the ideological counter to the regressive points that the Islamic State are making.
Afshin, we're tight on time here. I want Hassan to get to say something as well before we end the show. So please be brief if you can.
I think just very quickly, I mean, if you look at the map of the so-called Islamic State, they primarily have been successful in areas with a majority Sunni population who have been extremely disenfranchised, extremely marginalized by their states. When you do look at the map, you see that they primarily have been successful. The very fact that they have been able to mobilize a very disenfranchised, a very alienate group of people, that doesn't automatically qualify them to call for the formation of a new nation state. If we really have to confront the Islamic State, we need to look at the roots of the problem. We need to look at the implications of sectarianism. We need to look at the tribal structures. We need to look at actually the cultural structures. I think these are far more important to help us to understand the enemy, and without understanding the enemy, without understanding the challenges, we really cannot come up with a cohesive and meaningful policy.
And Hassan, these attacks were meant to provoke fear, suspicion, polarization, animosity between different communities. I mean, if that actually happens, ISIL has won, hasn't it?
Absolutely, I think this is key. ISIS thrives on polarization, whether in sectarian terms, whether in the region when it strikes against Shia. Inside Shia mosques in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, but also inside Sunni mosques, it polarizes Sunni, the Sunni community itself, but also a Muslim community as a whole. When it strikes in the West, it also polarizes. It kind of what it seeks to do is basically to increase the anti-Muslim sentiments in the West and gets Muslims to consider joining groups like ISIS. But I want to go back to this kind of issue of whether ISIS is a state or not. I think ISIS is monolithic, and it's always. I mean, ISIS can be, can be a conventional army in the way that it strikes and fights. And deploys troops to attack an area, but it's also a guerrilla it's a militia, it's a mafia. It's also in some circumstances, in some cases, it's actually more than a state. It's more intrusive than the states that predated ISIS in Iraq and Syria. For example, in the way that it treats and deals with tribes. It actually it tries to become an intermediary between tribes rather than like the old model where tribes become an intermediary between them, between the governments and communities.
And Hassan,
it's helpful to see.
Yeah, the point I was trying to make a little earlier with Afshin, Hassan, was that ISIL as well is capable of metamorphosizing. It is of changing shape, isn't it, if you attack it?
Absolutely. I think this is something that American military officials who had dealt with ISIS before its recent rise, as in before it became ISIS, when it was ISI, or Islamic State in Iraq, they recognized that this organization is nothing like we've seen before, in the words of one military official. They know how to fight, they know how to deploy human intel, they know how, when they go to a certain town, they already know so much about that town that they entrench themselves very quickly, and it's very hard to expel them. And once you expel them, they keep sleeper cells in town, and they move to another town. It's they play this classical whack-a-mole game.
Gentlemen, there, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it. We're out of time. Many thanks indeed to you all. Hassan Hassan in London, Afshin Shahi in Manchester, and Elliot Ackerman in New York. Thank you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on our discussion at the programme page on our website, aljazeera.com. And you can post your views at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can tweet us at AJ Inside Story. Thanks for watching from me, Adrian Finnegan, and all the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.